Hi, church family. I pray you're all doing well. I don't know if you're listening to this during the time of the COVID virus and our churches being shut, or if maybe they're open now. Either way, I pray that you're doing well and that God is with you and you feel His leading and presence in your life. Today, I just want to share a little bit from my heart about how in the world it is we survive in a broken world. How do we go day by day when we're faced with trials and challenges? We're all looking forward to that day when Jesus comes, when everything will be made new. But until that day, how do we carry on? I want to read you a very well-known piece of scripture from 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12 and 13. Many of you probably know this by heart, but listen to these words of Peter to us. He says, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also the revelation of His glory you may rejoice with exultation." COVID-19 aside, have you ever had to deal with a true curveball that was thrown into you in your life? A moment that came upon you all of a sudden that just changed the course of your life forever. Maybe some of you have suffered an illness. Maybe some of you an accident, or maybe a career change that you weren't expecting or wanted to have to make. Maybe you lost somebody that was very important in your life, a mentor, a friend, that changed everything. For me, probably my big curveball came when I was just 17 years old, almost 18. I was 3 days from starting my senior year of school, and my sister and I were in a car accident. My sister fell asleep while she was driving. I was asleep already, and we went off the road and hit a pole. Thankfully, she wasn't hurt, and I'm really grateful for that. The pole kind of entered the side of the car where I was sitting, and I had some pretty dramatic injuries. They did emergency surgery that night because I had a lot of internal bleeding, and they saved my life. I am so grateful for the people that were there. But I also broke my back, and I had no feeling from my waist down. So after I healed from that surgery, they moved me to Charlotte, North Carolina, to Presbyterian Hospital, where they began to think, how are we going to now work with the back? The doctors that first worked with me and the tests that were first run indicated there just wasn't going to be enough muscle return for me to walk again. But they did back surgery, and they did a beautiful job. I even today don't have hardly any back pain. And then I began my journey in a rehab hospital. I spent about 4, almost 5 months in one. By the way, if you ever start to feel sorry for yourself, go and spend a few minutes in a rehab hospital. I was the only one in there out of almost 200 patients who were going to walk out of there. All the rest of them were either paralyzed from their waist down, and many of them were paralyzed from their neck down. And when I saw what they had to deal with, I tell you what, you began thanking the Lord for what you have. But it altered my plans. I was going to be a PE teacher. That was my plans. Go to college after my senior year and take education, but that wasn't going to be in my future anymore. What was going to happen? Well, God was good. I was able to walk out of that hospital in January with crutches, and 4 months later walk down the graduation aisle with my class with a cane, because more muscle kept coming back to me, and how grateful I am. I had a very interesting experience, though, about 2 or 3 years later. I was still walking with a cane at that time, and I was taking guitar lessons from a fellow at downtown Chattanooga. And he was a Christian. He wasn't an Adventist. He was a Christian. And I took lessons from him week after week all through that semester. Finally, after several months, I was getting ready to leave, and he said, "I can't stand this anymore." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry. Am I playing? Am I not doing?" "No, you're doing okay on the guitar." He says, "That's not." He says, "It's your limp and your cane." And I says, well, what is upsetting? He says, "I thought all of you out there at Southern Adventist University," it was called Southern Missionary College in those days, I thought you all were Christians." I said, "Well, it is a Christian college, and I am a Christian." He goes, "No, you're not." I said, "Well, why would you say that?" And he said, "Well, look at you." He said, "If you were a Christian, God would have healed you." What would you say to him? I was a young man. I didn't know exactly what to say. I thought for a few minutes, and finally I looked at him. I said, "Well," I said, "what I do know is that the Lord let me walk again, and I didn't think I was going to ever do that. And I know in Scripture," I said, "Paul had a thorn in the flesh that he lived with his whole life. So I said, maybe this is my thorn in the flesh." But I told him it was a miracle that I was there of God, and I was grateful for what he had done. What are we going to do with those curveballs? Peter says we can expect them. They're going to come our way. And we share in the sufferings of Christ, and in doing so, when we do so, we actually can show his glory to the world, he says, until that day that he comes when there'll be no more limps or no more other tragedies that we're having to deal with or carry. So what does Jesus say about this? What did Jesus say to the disciples during times of crisis? Well, there was several times in Scripture when the disciples were in trouble, and Jesus was there, and sometimes the disciples did pretty well with that, and sometimes they didn't. One of my favorite stories of what Jesus said to them and tried to help them with during times of crisis comes in Mark chapter 4, in a passage you all know very, very well. This is the time when Christ invited everyone to get in the boat with him and to cross over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, he'd been preaching all day long. A number of years ago, matter of fact, I think it was about 35 years ago, I was taking a seminar from Dr. Zamora, who at the time was a theology professor at what is now Washington Adventist University. And he was telling us about his research and what he had done with Mark chapter 4 and this story of Christ on the sea when the storm came. He said, we got to remember two things. He said, all the people who heard that invitation from Jesus and the culture that they were in and what Jesus was asking of them, they all understood two things very clearly. Number one, when Jesus gave the invitation for everyone to come and get in the boats, because there was more than his boat. Remember, there are other boats there. That was an invitation, if you will, to be a follower of him, to be one of his disciples. If you will, it was an invitation to join his church. And everyone who got in those boats understood that, he said. And secondly, he said, they all understood that this was also during a time of year that you could expect storms to arise on the Sea of Galilee. So everybody understood those two things. It was an invitation to come and be part of his church and go out in the storm. Now that added so much color to this story for me because it helps me understand what Peter's saying in 1 Peter chapter 4, to be part of his church, to be one of his people, to be one of his disciples means we're going to go out into the storm. We can expect it. This is such an amazing story, though, and we just need to read it together. So I want to read that to you now, and then we'll take it and talk about a few things that Jesus said to teach us what we do during the time of a storm. So this is Mark chapter 4, verse 35, and he says, "On that day, when evening came, he said to them, 'Let us go over to the other side.' Leaving the crowd, they took him along with him in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat, so much so that the boat was already filling up. Jesus himself was asleep in the stern on a cushion. And they woke him and said, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?' And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Hush, be still.' And the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them, 'Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?' They became very much afraid and said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" That's quite a story. And you know, I'm not an expert in the sea. But I do know this, that the sea rages long after the wind and the storm is gone. But when Jesus spoke, the wind ceased and the water became flat calm. What a miracle. So church family, there are three things that I see here that Jesus is teaching them. And three things that I think he wants us to learn until then. Until that day he comes and the storms are no longer part of our journey. But there are three things that he's teaching us as we become his people, as we're part of his church, as we're his disciples going out in the storm. There are three things. Number one, he's preserving us. Just as he preserved the disciples, the wind and the waves ceased, and they were all safe. I don't think I'm talking to anybody here who can't think of a time in their life that if it wasn't for the preserving grace of Jesus, you just wouldn't be here right now. Every one of us have a story. Every one of us probably have multiple stories. But one of the first things we see in this story, Christ preserved his people. Number two, you may not like this one, but I got to cover it anyway because it's in the story. Christ is disciplining his people. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever been disciplined by God? You know, he says to them, "Why are you afraid? Why is it you still have no faith? I'm right here in the boat with you. You're not alone. The creator of all of this is here." I love Hebrews chapter 12. I call it God's woodshed. For those whom he loves, he chastens or disciplines. Don't you love that? I had loving parents who loved to discipline. You know, they used the hands-on approach, if you know what I mean. And I can never remember a time in my life when I was receiving one of those moments of discipline from them, when I turned around and looked up in the eye and said, "Mom, Dad, thank you for that fresh revelation of love," you know. But I can tell you that I rise up and call them blessed today. Because if I have any discipline in me at all, I owe it to them. Don't be afraid of God's discipline. Don't rebel against it or reject it. Because it comes from the purest heart of love in the universe. So number 2, he was disciplining them. And so finally, number 3, he's preparing them. Notice what they say to each other. They say, you know, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? I think at that moment they learned more about who Jesus was and who they were. God was preparing them for the great service that he had in mind for them. So I told you I was in that rehab hospital for 4 or 5 months, and it was an interesting time. I met some interesting characters. I want to tell you about a couple of them. The first one I want to tell you about is a guy named Bob. One of the most tragic cases I've ever seen in my life. How I met Bob is the way it worked in rehab. You know, you're no longer sick, if you will, anymore. When you're in a rehab hospital, you're just trying to, you know, gain your muscle and learn skills to be as independent as you can in life with whatever it is you have. And so I went to physical therapy in the morning and in the afternoon. And I had a therapist. Her name was Beth Little, one of the greatest human beings to walk the planet. She really was. And she had 3 or 4 of us that she worked with in the morning and the afternoon. We were there for about an hour. We had different exercises she'd assign us all to do. And one of the people that came during my time that worked with Beth Little was a guy named Bob. Bob was in his early 30s. And his life was just on track. He had the world by the horns, you know. He was an electronic engineer, was working for an up-and-coming business there in Charlotte, North Carolina, had a wife and 2 children. And one night, in the middle of the night, one of the kids started to cry, and he said, you know, I'll take care of this. And he went upstairs and took care of whatever it was. And on his way back down the stairs, he tripped on a toy that one of his kids had left. And he tumbled down the stairs, and Bob broke his neck. And he broke it very high. And he had no movement at all, except a little bit in his shoulders. He could do this. That is all he had. And so that was the only exercise that he had to work on when he came to physical therapy. But it was, the other piece about Bob you need to know is he was the most bitter man that I've ever met. And I can understand it. Put yourself in his shoes. Bob lost everything. He lost his job. His wife couldn't bear seeing him anymore, so she divorced him and never brought the children. He had no siblings, and his parents had passed away. Put yourself in Bob's shoe. He was alone in this world. Went from having everything he wanted to having nothing but the ability to move his shoulders like this, and completely dependent on people he didn't know. And he was angry. And he swore terrible. He yelled at everybody. He was just mad at the world. And it was the same thing every time he came to physical therapy. You could hear him down the hall. You know, they start to roll him down. I don't want to go. You can't make me. And of course they could make him. There wasn't much you could do. And so they would roll him to physical therapy, and he'd look at Beth and says, I'm not doing my exercises today. And Beth would just smile, and she'd pick him up, and she'd put him in this special chair and backed him up against the wall. And she put his arms in braces and hands in braces, and then she attached a pulley that was attached to the wall into his hands. And his whole job was to do this with those weights on the wall. And she'd say, okay, Bob, but you can't go back to your room until you do your exercises, so you can just sit there. And he'd sit there and fume. He'd yell at everybody. He kept trying to pick fights with everybody. And I'd say, Bob, it's not going to go well for you, man. He didn't care. He was just angry. And it was the same thing twice a day. You know, he'd do his reps after a while. Okay, I'm done. I demand to go to my room, you know. And when she was finished, she'd put him back on the stretcher they had, and they would take him back to his room. It happened twice every day. After a while, I was up in a wheelchair going around, and actually had a lot of free time on my hands, and I was a young guy. So one day at the end of my physical therapy, Beth said to me, she said, I wish you to go see a young man that just came in. He's about a year younger than you, Gary, but maybe you can talk with him. He's really hurting, and he won't talk to any of us. And I said, sure. So I got in my chair, and I rolled down the hall and went over to the C wing where they had him. I was on the A wing, and went down the hallway and pushed the door open with my foot and wheeled in there. And I wasn't ready for what I saw. I wasn't prepared for it. Rex was on a striker frame. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's a bed that you can lay on, and then they can put another bed on top of you and then flip it like this and turn you over. And it's an important bed to help so bed sores don't come. But he was also in traction. Rex had broken his neck, and he had these tongs in his skull that were attached to weights on a pulley to keep his head straight. And I rolled in by his bed, and I said, whoa, I said, hi, you're Rex, right? There was no answer. Oh, I'm Gary, and boy, the food here is terrible, right? I didn't know what to say to him, and I tried to talk with him. I never got him to say a word. See, what happened to Rex was on his 17th birthday, he and a carload of his buddies went out to his uncle's farm for his birthday. And his uncle had a big pond that they were looking forward to swimming in. And when they got out of the car, one of his buddies said, let's throw Rex in. And Rex says, you're not throwing me in. And he went off running for the water. He was going to dive in before they could throw him in. And he ran off the end of the dock. And when he drove in, where it used to be fairly deep water, was only about 1.5 feet. And so Rex broke his neck even higher than Bob. And I don't think Rex can move anything from his neck down. I went back, I don't know, 2 or 3 more times. But it was the same result every time. I could never get him to talk to me. Well, let me tell you about one day. It was quite a day at the Charlotte Rehab Hospital. Went through our normal routine, and Bob was his normal self. And, cantankerous yelling and just being belligerent to everyone. And he did finish his exercises, and Beth put him back on a stretcher. And she said to him, she said, Bob, before you go back to your room, I want to take you somewhere. And he says, I don't want to go anywhere. He says, I know my rights. And she says, well, we're going to go anyway. I said to myself, this is going to be good. So I got in my chair, and it was good. It was very entertaining. I got in my chair, and I followed them down the hallway, and he was yelling at everybody. Call the police. I'm being kidnapped. I'm being taken against my will. My lawyer, I'm going to sue, and you're going to, it was just all the way down the hall and down over through a corridor that went over to the C wing. And Beth took him to Rex's room. She pushed the door open with the end of his stretcher. And she pushed him in Rex's room and put him just head to head. She made the stretcher the same height as that striker frame, lowered it so they were head to head. And I was sitting in the door frame of that room, my wheelchair, just watching it. And for the first time, Bob had nothing to say. He looked over at Rex. Bob became quiet. And you could see Rex, he couldn't turn his head with the traction that they had. He looked over and he saw Bob on that stretcher. And then I heard Rex speak the first words I ever heard him speak. He looked at Bob and he said, "You understand, don't you?" And Bob said, "Yeah, I get it." I'll never forget that. Well, I finished my time in that hospital and went on and finished school, high school, was in college. Finished college and got married to Diane. Best decision ever. And I don't remember exactly how many years. I imagine it was 6 to 7 years after I had left there that we were in Spartanburg and we were visiting her folks, and I just wanted to go to Charlotte. And really honestly, just to go to see Beth. See if she was still there and thank her for what she did for me. So we drove about an hour and 45-minute drive up there. And we parked there outside and went up to the second floor where the rehab part of the hospital was. And when the doors of the elevator opened up, sitting in front of me was Bob. They had rigged a wheelchair for him, and it had a little inner circle on the outside of his tires, or a smaller circle, I should say, that had little knobs all the way around that circle. And what Bob could do, because he had his arms in braces and his hands in a brace, he could take it and put his hands on one of those knobs and do this. And then he could pull back to the next knob and do this. And Bob could go anywhere in that hospital he wanted to. He had a right to, because he was the chaplain. So I went and I found Beth, and I said, "Beth," I said, I saw Bob. And she said, yeah. And I said, he looked good. She said, yeah. He said, "You won't believe this, but he's our chaplain." And she said, "He's the best chaplain we've ever had." Because you see, it wouldn't matter what room Bob willed himself into in that hospital. Whatever room that he went into, he could look who's ever in that bed and say, "I understand." And what a powerful ministry he had to those who had been thrown a huge curveball in their life. So, Iowa, Missouri church family, the next time you get that proverbial curveball in your life, the next time you find that moment that just takes your breath away, and you wonder how you're going to get through, don't say, "Why, Lord?" Why are you letting this happen? Don't say why. Say what, Lord? What are you preparing for me to do? What are you getting me ready for in terms of the service that I can do in your vineyard? All I know is until the Lord comes, until that day when he makes all things new, when all things are right again, when sin is no more, there are no more storms, there are no more trials. Until that day, don't forget, when we're part of his church, he's in the boat with us. And he'll preserve us. He'll discipline us and help us on those rough edges. And he's going to prepare you for a service and a ministry far greater than you can ever imagine. So take good care. Be of good courage. And I'll close with the words of Paul when he said in Colossians, "May the very God of peace sanctify you wholly." And I pray, God, your whole spirit, soul, and body will be preserved blameless unto the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. God bless.